So what were we saying? Yes. Annihilation of time and space, of time and space becoming less of a factor. And yeah, above all else, the costs of doing these sorts of transactions becoming um, um, being reduced almost to the point of insignificance. Okay, so yeah, so we customarily talk about living in this sort of globalized world. And I might have said this before, but when I was starting to study international relations in the 1990s, globalization was very much the watchword. If you wanted to get anything published in the 1990s in the area of international relations, it had to have the G word somewhere in the title. That's only a slight exaggeration. Okay, so globalization. Now, obviously, there's been much debate in the literature, among practitioners, among academics, as to the extent to which, I suppose in general terms, whether or not globalization is a force for good, whether globalization has improved our lives and is continuing to improve our lives, or whether there are significant negative consequences being associated with that. And given the current situation in the world today, there's one obvious negative consequence which springs to mind. So yeah, as I said, there's been a general debate about all of that sort of stuff in the literature, and I suppose a subset of that debate is whether or not globalization is is a process which has resulted in the spread of democracy, strengthening democratic institutions in various countries, or whether, in contrast, it might well, in some ways at least, undermine democracy. So I think there's an ongoing debate. And looking at the literature for this class, I think to some extent, that is reflected in at least some of the arguments that the various kind of authors advance, which we will consider in a moment. Okay, right. Let us move on. Okay, the emergence of the current global economic system. You have all been students of Dr. Golonka, so I'm pretty sure this will be fairly familiar, but just to sort of restate the obvious, I suppose. Well, instead of going through this blow by blow, because as I say, I'm sure we're kind of familiar with this. I'll just make one general point, and that is that the system that emerges after the Second World War doesn't kind of evolve by accident. Okay, so the institutions which are constructed are clearly part of this sort of wider project to establish an open, liberal, global economy led by the United States, but supported by its European partners and Japan and other industrialized countries. The general point here is that globalization doesn't happen by accident. Sometimes when you look at the literature, you almost get the sense that globalization is some sort of unstoppable natural force. Like the weather, something that just is there that you can't actually control. That clearly isn't the case. When you look at that kind of history, globalization happens as a result of particular policy choices, choices in the area of global economics that are taken at the end of the Second World War. And obviously, the chief motivation for that is that decision makers, policy makers were drawing on their experience of the Second World War, but also the Depression. And above all else, I think to explain why in terms of understanding why these institutions are constructed, their primary motivation, I think, is to avoid another major depression, which had kind of plunged the world into chaos in the 1930s, as well as, I suppose, the experience of the Second World War and this awareness that international cooperation, collaboration was going to be necessary in order to maintain a rules-based international order once the war had actually come to an end. So you had the Bretton Woods Conference, convened, I think, in 1944, New Hampshire, which involves the world's big industrialized economies. Soviet Union also has a seat at the table, although obviously it does not become a part of the kind of global economic financial system that emerges after the war. But yeah, broadly speaking, as I say, it's the United States that plays the leadership role in putting these institutions in place. And post World War II, the United States, throughout the Cold War into the post Cold War era, generally favoured this rules-based international system. Okay, right. Just looking at the slide, forgotten about this. Okay, yeah. Again, I think this is all pretty standard boilerplate stuff. But yeah, as I say, globalization doesn't happen by accident. As I say, the world that is created. That's not to say that I think policymakers were necessarily sort of completely aware of what they were unleashing. Possibly not. But as I say, globalization is the result of distinct policy choices. Essentially, there is this commitment to free trade. A second point there, I'm just reading it. Increase in global trade also results in increased transmission of Western ideas to other parts of the world, which again kind of comes back to the idea that globalization, although the motor of globalization might be economic and trade and things like that, globalization is a sort of multifaceted phenomenon, or the consequences of globalization, are certainly not, obviously not limited just to the economic sphere. And if you buy into this line of argument, it certainly has been argued that democracy does become stronger in some regions during the Cold War, especially towards the end of the Cold War, in East Asia, Southern and Central America, whereas other areas of the world reacted against it, e.g., Africa and the Middle East. So, as I say, there's sort of mixture of trends, and again, we'll get into how that pans out in a bit more detail in a moment. Okay, right. So that's just sketching in some of the history. As I said, I'm sure you're pretty aware of all of this already, so I'm not going to labour this point for too long. Good. Okay, we may as well consider this before. I want to get into the sort of more theoretical arguments about globalization, whether or not it does actually strengthen or weaken democratic institutions, and the various arguments that have been advanced both ways. Excuse me. Before we go there, though, let's just quickly just look at this. The Washington Consensus. So yeah, these are, I think we might have alluded to this before, I can't remember, but yeah, this is obviously a sort of semi-ironic name given to the policies that were being pursued in the 1980s by the World Bank. This was associated with the fact that the International Monetary Fund, this is the third point there, the International Monetary Fund forced states in the developing world to pursue policies that became known as structural adjustment, which essentially, I think in today's terms, we would describe as encouraging them to pursue neoliberal policies. Essentially, again, as we can see here, basically calling for less government intervention, a reduction of tariffs between states, smaller government, a kind of forcing governments to kind of respect intellectual property rights, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, the United States obviously has a really big influence in this process. That's why it becomes known as the sort of Washington Consensus. But the idea being basically, again, it sort of kind of buys into this sort of neoliberal vision that, if states sort of pursue these policies, this would encourage economic growth, and over time, as these economies started growing, there would be increased pressure for them to adopt democratic political institutions. And again, we will talk about that. Critics basically argue, and again, we'll come on to this debate, argued that what essentially emerges is, as I say, that's the final point there, is elite representative democracy and free market economy, or low intensity democracy, or polyarchy, as it's also sometimes described as. So the models that were actually encouraged in the developing world bore a passing resemblance, let's say, to the United States itself. Okay, right. All right. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about this. Okay, the third wave of democracy. Right. It's going to be my next question, really. The third wave, an idea put forward by Samuel Huntingdon, I think at the beginning of the 1990s. He talked about this idea of a third wave. What was, I suppose, very simply, what was Huntingdon's argument? And how does this sort of play into this idea of globalization and democracy? Have we got any? As I say, if you want to unmute your microphones and speak, if you want to. First of all, what was the third wave? I'm sure somebody else has talked about this with you guys. No. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, Artsa. Yes. Yeah. Yes, yeah, Romania, yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description. Actually, I'm not entirely sure your final point was entirely correct because I think, I think Huntingdon was sort of incorporating. Well, yeah, I think you said South Asia, didn't you? Okay, but yeah, I mean, I think he was sort of incorporating areas like South Korea as well into his argument, as as sort of evidence for this idea that there was a sort of wave of democracy breaking across the world. But yeah, I mean, basically, Huntington's argument. Obviously, he's the same guy who comes up with this idea of the clash of civilizations as well, which might also be sort of relevant to what we're talking about. But Huntington's basic argument is that democracy seems to come in waves. He said there's a first wave, a second wave. To be honest, I can never remember exactly when the two previous waves were, according to Huntington. But anyway, as Artsum said. He then posits that there is a third wave breaking out, and he says, it starts in the sort of mid to late 1970s. I think he more or less sort of traces it back to the revolutions on the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish and the Portuguese revolutions, in which Franco and Salazar, the authoritarian regimes there, are sort of overturned. And democratic institutions begin to be restored. Greece too, obviously another Mediterranean country in the 1980s. democratizes after a period of military rule. Yeah, it traces this again. You could add sort of South Korea to the list, which by the end of the 1980s was also democratizing, and then of course you had the end of the Cold War, so the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet withdrawal from Eastern Europe, the various countries in Eastern Europe adopting democratic institutions. So yeah, he basically says, yeah, this is a wave. How does that relate to sort of globalization, or how does Huntingdon, I suppose, explain why these waves happen? Anybody want to come in here? No? All right. Let's head on to the next slide then. Okay. Remind myself here. Okay. So yeah, as I said, so this is kind of summarizing Huntingdon's argument here. So yeah, democracy basically comes in waves. Third wave, as we said, 1974, lasts till 1990s. And he posits here that 1974, only 25 countries, about 33% of the world's states were democratic. By 1996, 66 were becoming democratic. Again, obviously, as I say, I started studying international relations in the 1990s. And again, this sort of expansion of democracy, that was something that was, very much talked about in this period. Obviously, you've got people like Francis Fukuyama as well coming out saying that we had now reached the end of history. Democracy had triumphed. We were all going to become good capitalists, all the rest of it. But yeah, I mean, go back to Artson's final point. I mean, yeah, Artson's certainly correct that this is not a process that is spread uniformly across the globe. Some regions seem to more readily adopt democratic institutions than others. The key areas, obviously, Eastern Europe, to some extent, South America as well. Other parts of the world, notably, the developing world, Africa, places like that, were somewhat lagging. But generally speaking, yeah, as I say, Huntingdon argues that that there were these waves. That once this process began, it seemed, for various reasons, which we can consider in a moment, but these processes seemed to gather their own momentum and would kind of ripple out across continents or whatever. Obviously, some debate, though, about how valid Huntingdon's thesis actually was. I mean, on the face of it, it's certainly true. It did seem in the 1990s that more countries were adopting democratic institutions. On the other hand, there were debates about, well, as ever, let's say, there were debates about whether particular individual cases, whether they were necessarily fully democratic. So you kind of had this debate as to exactly what constitutes a democratic government. The other thing to say, I mean, again, I remember this period quite well, but there were an awful lot of sort of populist leaders as well. Then as now, I suppose, who were sort of claiming support, but who weren't necessarily particularly liberal in their inclinations. So some debate about exactly how democratic some of these regimes actually were. The third wave, as I say, seemed to also coincide with this acceleration of globalization. So unsurprisingly, many people sort of made the link between globalization and the spread of democracy, although obviously correlation isn't necessarily cause, and we can come on to that. On the other hand, many commentators, obviously, I don't think this is a particularly controversial point, made the connection between economic development and democracy, and the general rule of thumb, as we all know, is that the more developed an economy is, the far more likely it is what it would be to be democratic, if I'm right. I think I've got a couple of quotations, yes, from Timothy Garton Ash, which I took from one of his books. He summarizes this sort of line, or this sort of line of argument quite succinctly here. When he basically says, freedom and development are inextricable. Okay, so they are kind of interwoven, connected. Only above a certain level of development can we seriously talk of people being free, but equally a certain level of political freedom, good government, and the rule of law is indispensable for development. You have to be free to develop and develop to be free. So that sort of kind of paradox there right at the end. You need a certain level of freedom in order to develop. At least that's how it seems when Ash wrote his book, which was I think it was published around 2003, 2004. I think he quotes an economist who's noted that above about $6,500 per head, it is rare for a country not to be a democracy. Below $2,000 per head, it is rare for a country to remain a democracy for long. The tasks of freedom and development are therefore inseparable. So, in other words, if you want to promote democracy, you have to also promote economic development as well. The two, as Garton Ash says, seem pretty much inextricable. Now, then you kind of lead on to the debate as to whether or not globalization necessarily does this. That by countries integrating themselves fully into the global economy, is that a recipe for economic development, and will it ultimately lead to a strengthening of democratic institutions? Again, somebody like Francis Fukuyama, I'm guessing, or at least Francis Fukuyama in the 1990s, anyway, would probably have argued more or less anyway in favour of that. Others, as I say, would be perhaps a bit more sceptical of this line of argument. But the general point, as I say, going back to Huntingdon, the general point is, Huntingdon says there are these waves of democracy, and as I say, the third wave in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s seems to sort of correspond with this period of globalization, and it should also be noted, certainly in the 1990s, the world as a whole, at least most of the world, maybe not so much sub-Saharan Africa, but large parts of the world were certainly getting richer. And again, you can debate whether or not that was a consequence of globalization. So again, this connection between economic development, globalization, and democracy. There were plenty of people around in the 1990s who were trying to make all these connections. Okay, right. That was my next point. So international factors that result in the spread of democracy. So coming back to why are there these waves of democracy? Why does one or two states embarking upon this process of democratization, why does that then sort of seemingly lead to the sort of domino effect, as I put here, and that other countries adopting it? One argument that Huntingdon puts forward, and I think a lot of people were repeating in the 1990s, and I think one of the articles on the reading list, I think it's the Schwartzman article, discusses this as well. But this idea that the international environment might in some way be congenial to democratization. So there was, in other words, there was something in the 1990s, if I can put it that way, something in the international environment in the 1990s which led which was particularly conducive to the spread of democracy. So you have the Cold War ending, collapse of the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe. Various opposition movements in Eastern Europe coming to power, committed to democracy, and sort of, I suppose, international media information, looking at what this is happening, encouraging others, in the region and perhaps elsewhere in the world to sort of follow suit. So, one of the arguments certainly that Huntingdon puts forward, and as I say, other sort of writers, on this topic have suggested, is that there are perhaps periods in international history in which the environment is perhaps unusually conducive to the spread of democracy. This idea that there is some kind of domino effect. So again, if you think about the end of the Cold War, you have in Poland the Round Table in 1988, in which there's a sort of brokering of a compromise between the communist Polish government, Solidarity, the church acting as an intermediary. Elections take place, I think, if I'm getting my history right here, in 1988, and a non-communist government is elected to office, and that seemingly sort of inspiring other countries, in the region. So, Czechoslovakia follows suit pretty quickly, other countries, and before you know it, communism is sort of collapsing in Eastern Europe. The various countries in the region, one by one, adopting democratic institutions, and then perhaps encouraging this process in other parts of the world. I mean, again, I remember, is it entirely a coincidence that roughly the same period, South Africa also begins to reform. Apartheid comes to an end. Black majority rule is introduced in South Africa, and you can, as I say, you can find similar cases in other parts of the world. So all this, this idea that it's a regional phenomenon, but it can also kind of spread out almost globally. The international environment is sometimes one factor which is presented as a reason why the spread of democracy might be might take off at particular junctures in history. Okay, I can't remember what's on the next slide now. Okay, this was going to be my next question, really, so I'll go back a bit. Reasons. My question is reasons as to why globalization might actually encourage the promotion of democracy or the democratization in particular countries. As I say, this is a debatable argument. There are certainly plenty of other people who would argue against this, but we'll take the arguments first in terms of globalization being a force which favors democracy and democratization. Anybody want to come out and raise some answers? Howard, just give me a moment. I'm just going to close my door because it's sort of banging in the background. So just 1 second. Okay, so I'm back. Yeah, anybody want to come in? Yeah, okay, good. Elizabeth? Yeah, absolutely. Transmission of values. And, in some way, I mean, again, you can trace this almost back, pre-war era. I mean, one of the points I always like to make is that the British Empire is almost a sort of first version of globalization. That, again, you see this transmission of values, of sort of liberal values sort of seeping into the colonies. liberal ideas, self-government, self-determination, democracy, whatever, as well as rival ideologies like nationalism and communism and things like that. But yeah, transmission of cultural values, that's definitely one aspect of globalization. So ideas, values sort of seeping their way into the developing world or geographical regions which have been kind of removed from Europe, North America. Yeah, definitely. Um, that's definitely one factor. Any others we could think of? Yeah, absolutely. So there's certainly a sort of counter reaction, as you say, in the Middle East and all the rest of it. So yeah, so Elizabeth saying, yeah, there's this transmission of cultural values, and that's certainly true. But there's also, of course, a very strong counter reaction of those who are intensely dislike or are disturbed by this sort of transmission by these sorts of transmissions. So that's certainly true. It's not, but in any means, a one-way process, or the fact that people kind of willingly embrace them. Nevertheless, I mean, as we all know, the spread of this, if you like, kind of Westification, Americanization, that's an incredibly powerful force in the sense that millions and millions of people around the world are suddenly watching Hollywood films, American television dramas, wearing Levi jeans, drinking Coca-Cola, whatever. So it is an incredibly powerful force. But yeah, I mean, Artsam's certainly right to say that there's also a sort of countervailing reaction to all of this as well, which we will consider. Don't worry. Let's just stay with this, with the arguments for the moment of globalization, as I say, being a process which encourages democratization. Yeah, anybody else want to additional points anybody wants to make? No? Okay, we'll consider the next slide. The first point again is an obvious point, but we will make it nonetheless. Okay, this is interesting. Okay, so this is the sort of liberal argument here. As I say, I think I first started teaching this course 10, 15 years ago. Well before, I suppose, social media. I mean, I think before social media even existed, but certainly well before it really took off in a large way. So this, I think, is quite interesting, and we might come back to this. But the general liberal argument, certainly, at 90s, beginning of the 21st century, there was this notion that technology, communication, all these things seem to weaken the ability of authoritarian regimes to control their populations. Put bluntly, people could see what was happening in other parts of the world, whether it was the United States, Europe. They could see, the standard of living that people from these regions enjoyed. They could see the sort of political freedoms that were available to them, and that in itself had a very sort of corrosive effect on the legitimacy of non-democratic governments. So the argument here is that technology, communication, all of this sort of kind of serves to sort of weaken the authority, legitimacy of authoritarian governments, and of course their ability to control their populations, or to restrict what their populations can see and hear about what is happening in the outside world, which is point number 2, basically, how to restrict information about what's happening on the outside. Greater opportunities for opposition groups to coordinate their activities. One of the chapters, actually, I think a couple of the readings make this example about what was happening in Poland in the 1980s. So solidarity, which comes into existence beginning of the 1980s in Poland. Surprisingly, they were able to use, initially at least, phones and radio to coordinate their activities. For some reason, the communist authorities didn't actually close these down before Solidarity had time to organize themselves into a national movement. So Solidarity were quite adept at using, what in the 1980s was pretty primitive communications technology, at least by today's standard. Again, we're talking about communist Poland here, early 80s. But nonetheless, they were able to use what, fairly limited technology there was to organize themselves into a national movement. More recent examples, of course, which I haven't put on the slide because basically I wrote it before this happened, so I probably ought to update it. But I mean, the more recent examples we could think of is the role of social media during the Arab Spring, with, again, an incident starting. And again, I suppose we're onto this sort of wave, well, in this case, not so much a wave of democracy, but at least a wave of revolution spreading across North Africa and into the Middle East. So, a relatively small incident happening in Tunisia, being the spark which leads to this wider kind of explosion across the region. A lot of that, of course, banned by social media. So people being able to, get the news out, take video footage from using their phones and posting it, and all the rest of it. And it's interesting. I mean, I remember, Mark Zuckerberg and others at the time saying, look at things like Facebook or whatever, Twitter. This is I'm not sure if Twitter was even, I can't remember when did Twitter come into being? I can't remember, but certainly Facebook was around then. Zuckerberg basically saying, look at this, social media is this wonderful positive force. People are able to communicate, organize against the nasty authoritarian regimes. What a wonderful guy I am. Everybody love me, please. That was very much the message kind of coming out of Facebook. When was it? 10 years ago. Obviously, the debate has moved on somewhat since then. But that argument sort of played into this, played into this sort of kind of liberal view that that technology and communication and all these things sort of were factors which strengthened democratic institutions. The counterpoint, though, which again the textbook mentions, is that authoritarian regimes can also use technology to advance their to promote their message. The textbook example is Nazi Germany, which was very adept at using cinema and other forms of propaganda to get its message across. More recently, of course, the role of social media. We can see now that it's a sort of double-edged sword. That yes, activists, anti-government activists, liberal groups can use it to promote it, but equally, so can neo-Nazis and even authoritarian regimes themselves, use social media to promote their message. Somebody like Vladimir Putin or Putin's Russia, very, very effective at manipulating social media in order, not only just to get their message out, but also to use it as a weapon in order to create confusion, disinformation, things like that. And it's interesting the way Zuckerberg's message has sort of evolved between as I say 2010, 2011, basically proclaiming Facebook to be this to be the savior. Now essentially saying Facebook isn't at all political. It's just there to upload cat videos or whatever. There's nothing political about it whatsoever, and trying to keep out of politics, or pretending anyway that Facebook is not remotely part of politics. So yeah, it's interesting, as I say. The debate about technology, that if anything seems more relevant today than maybe it was a few years ago. Okay, other factors, all right, which we could add to in terms of why globalization might help with the promotion of democracy. Excuse me. More economic resources as a result of development. So again, if you buy into this sort of liberal view, which again we sort of mentioned in passing last week, if you're a liberal, you tend to believe in free trade, which in today's terms might be globalization. I think I mentioned Clinton in passing last week. Clinton, very much a big believer in globalization. So if you buy into this idea that globalization promotes economic development, people will become more prosperous, more economic resources available to them. But as countries get richer, you then have, there is going to be some sort of internal dialogue as to how these resources are going to be distributed. And one argument that is made, and again, several articles on the reading list make this point. As countries develop economically, you get a class-based system, if you like. Sorry, a class-based system will emerge, or a modern class-based system will emerge. So you will have a working class, but you will also see the emergence of a middle class. They tend to be better educated, and above all else, they will probably demand some kind of say in how their countries are run, but also in terms of how they are going to be taxed and how money is going to be spent. So the argument here is that as a middle class emerges, there is going to be increasing pressure on governments to be sensitive, let's say, to their concerns. So again, there's almost a sort of logic there that economic development will, over time, lead to democratic institutions, and from this perspective, it's the bourgeois, it's the middle class, which are going to be, if anything, the sort of agents for change that will help a country along in terms of undertaking this transformation. Okay. A slightly, an alternative, similar line of argument, but in this case, I suppose it's a slightly more leftist or radical argument, but in this case, economic development also, will also, this theory also says that economic development will lead to promotion to democratize. In this case, though, it's the working class which are going to be agents for change. So as I said, it's a slightly more leftist view. So as countries industrialize, a working class will emerge. They will increasingly demand better pay conditions, form trade unions, and ultimately, these pressures will build up, and they will start to demand political representation instead. An example which again a couple of pieces, articles in the literature cite, is Franco's Spain, where there's increasing industrial unrest, dissatisfaction among the working classes with the authoritarian nature of Franco's Spain. You could make a similar example with Britain at the beginning of the 19th century with the rise of the Labour Party, and becoming more active in politics. Slightly different context, obviously, but again, solidarity in Poland in the 1980s, which was a working class movement, but that sort of relates to the final point Generally working classes needed to have the support of other social groups to be politically effective. That was certainly true in Poland, where you sort of have this alliance between workers and intellectuals and all the rest of it. Yeah, Austin, did you want to say something? Hi. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, so I didn't quite catch all of that. I think my internet connection. Yeah. Yeah. So everything. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I'm sure. Again, I will bow to your superior knowledge when it comes to Spanish social history and all the rest of it. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure. I'm sure you're kind of correct. I mean, my guess is, again, I'm going on very, very sort of sketchy knowledge here, but I mean, my guess is, I mean, I'm sure there was, a working class movement in Spanish politics in the 90s. Well, obviously there was in terms of, the conflicts between Spanish Republicans and the nationalists, led by Franco and the Civil War and all the rest of it. My guess is, though, I mean, Spain in the Spain in the 30s, 20s and 30s would have been a pretty poor country. So I guess industrialization was still fairly limited. So I'm guessing that was, fairly small, a relatively small social group, the Spanish the Spanish working class. I mean, I'm sure the bulk of the Spanish economy was still pretty agrarian. So maybe, with industrialization, and again, I'm hypothesizing now, but with Spanish industrialization, maybe that simply just made the working class more, more numerous, and I suppose politically more. Politically stronger in that regard. I mean, you're right. I mean, obviously, fascism either attempts to sort of co-opt the working class or repress it. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I'd say the readings, the couple of articles that mention this on the reading list sort of cite more detailed studies on Spain in this period. But as I say, it's sort of cited. But as I say, I admit not to having a particularly detailed knowledge on this particular case study. Um, yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, sure. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it kind of brings us back onto, we'll consider that in a moment, about, yeah, the sort of, I mean, I suppose the sort of Fukuyama argument is that, globalization, we all benefit, we're all getting richer. Yeah, some might get richer, more rich than others, but essentially through trickle down economics or whatever, ultimately we all sort of benefit from globalization. The counter argument, which is one you just made, is well, actually, no, not everybody necessarily does. The rich do very well out of it, but relatively speaking, the poor get even poorer. And as you say, that can certainly, that conceivably could kind of spark a sort of counter reaction. I mean, that could go either way. I mean, you could argue Trump is a sort of product of these sorts of consequences. A populist leader appealing to those who feel that they've been left behind. Essentially, saying, I will govern in your interest. I'm not going to let the Washington elite make all the decisions on your behalf anymore, all the rest of it. So yeah, I mean, I think, and so both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in their different ways as could be a sort of reaction to that. Yeah. But yeah, an interesting point. Okay, maybe we'll come back to that. So I think I'll probably better press on. Right. Okay, trying to remember what the next slide is talking about. Okay, globalization and democracy. Okay, so yeah, growth of capital markets. Okay, is this an argument in favor or against? I'm not sure. Okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, again, talking about globalization. So yeah, global capital markets. This idea that capital can kind of move in and out of states. Almost like water, in and out without much in the way of without much of friction. Effectively, you get a hollowing out of the state. So state power, state sovereignty, effectively sort of being eroded because of that. That can create conflicts of interest between non-democratic states and part of the capitalist class. So essentially, again, this is this idea that foreign direct investment and stuff like that can also sort of encourage countries along the line of democratization. The problem with that argument, though, is as we know, there are plenty of examples in which economic development hasn't actually led to democracy. The outstanding example of which, again, we mentioned several times, is China. So you can certainly find sort of counter examples where countries have enjoyed periods of rapid economic growth, but have not necessarily resulted in increasing sort of liberal institutions. Right. Okay, the kind of more critical approaches, and again, for sort of literature on the reading list mentions this. One argument is that yes, globalization might promote democratic institutions, but the quality of democracy that emerges is pretty limited. And we're back to this argument that you get polyarchy as opposed to popular democracy. Polyarchy, again, we mentioned this before, but polyarchy is this idea of a form of low intensity democracy. So you get you get democratic institutions, but they don't have much in the way of popular support or popular participation. So if you like, you almost get a sort of empty shell of a democracy. There are elections. People do vote for their political representatives, but participation doesn't really involve much more than that. And I've got a quotation from Robinson. Can't remember exactly which publication I took this from because there's a couple of things he's written on the reading list. So I should have put in a reference really. So it's my fault. Sorry about that. But wherever I took it from, he said polyarchy as a distinct form of elite rule performs the function of legitimating existing inequalities, but does so more effectively than authoritarianism. Okay, so it's sort of back to the point that Austin made a moment ago. This idea that globalization leads to inequality, and if it's embraced in its fullest form, the gap between rich and poor can actually conceivably widen quite dramatically. According to Robinson, this form of democratic system, polyarchy, basically acts as a sort of safety valve by giving, the poorest in society, the working class, or even, those who are underemployed or unemployed, who aren't participating in the workforce, giving them a sort of safety valve, giving them a feeling that they are having some kind of say in the system. But again, going back to Austin's point, you hear this complaint all the time, not just in the United States, but in plenty of other countries, certainly true in Britain as well, of people saying, it doesn't matter who you vote for, ultimately, they have their own interests. So it doesn't matter whether you get Labour government, Conservative government, Democrat, Republican. Ultimately, the policies they pursue are going to be in the interests of private capital, which is what I say on the third point there. So polyarchy, as I say, supports the interests of private capital. This clashes with the interests of labour unions. Again, you could point to the fact that in many countries in the Western world, but particularly Britain and the United States, the power and influence of trade unions has been greatly sort of diminished in the last 30 years or so. And one result of that is that wages among workers have been suppressed. Again, kind of showing the age of the slide, but when I wrote it, it's like arguably this is resulting in increased resistance, e.g., Occupy Wall Street, protests in Brazil. Over the years, we've also had plenty of sort of anti-globalization protests. So whenever there's a meeting of the G7 or G8 or whatever it is now, or the G20 even, plenty of people like to turn up and protest and all the rest of it. So again, there's a sort of, we have witnessed a sort of counter-reaction to some of this in recent years. So yeah, it kind of brings us back into the debate. Does globalization necessarily support democratic institutions? And if it does, what sort of institutions emerge? Okay, globalization, democracy. Oil shocks of the 1970s led to the collapse of some authoritarian regimes. Again, I think Huntingdon sort of makes this connection as well when he talks about the third wave, saying that external economic shocks can also contribute. Obviously, if you have a globalized system, then something like something happening in one part of the global economy or financial system can quickly kind of ripple around the whole global system. You see that in the 1970s, and the argument here that when oil prices start to skyrocket, that puts a lot of pressure on authoritarian regimes in some parts of the world. He's the example of Brazil in the 1970s is cited. Debt crisis in the 1980s has a sort of similar effect as as countries struggle to manage the effects of this. Should also be added that debt relief and foreign aid, that too is that often has various conditions attached to it, and political reform, democratic reform is often is often included among them. So there can be external pressures on states to pursue democratic reforms. All right, I've got something with Clinton. Okay, but just before we get on to, I think Clinton's sort of the concluding point. As I say, I wrote these slides a few years ago, and the bulk of them have been kind of the arguments in favour of this sort of connection between globalization and democracy. As I say, we mentioned Robinson, who's got a slightly more critical take. From the perspective of 2020, obviously we're right in the middle of a pandemic now, and which is having some pretty profound economic consequences. But yeah, from the perspective of 2020, what do we think? Is globalization still a force which is out there, which could conceivably promote democratic reform, or is it perhaps leading to a rise in authoritarianism? Obviously, the world today looks rather different from the time when Fukuyama or whoever was writing in the 1990s, or for that matter, Huntingdon. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the point you made earlier about the sort of counter reaction. There are plenty of people who are who 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 intensely dislike this sort of westernization of their cultures, beyond Europe and North America. So obviously the Middle East would be an outstanding example. But of course, you're seeing not just the rise of authoritarianism in these regions. You're seeing it in Europe today, possibly in the United States as well. Is that a consequence of globalization, or do we think? Yeah, Austin. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, you can make that argument. I mean, it's notable that perhaps those countries which have a much stronger sort of social, social model like Germany or Sweden or wherever, you, the sort of the reaction against it seems to be more muted. Although I mean, I suppose even in Germany you've got what is it now, the ADF or whatever it is, the Alternative for Deutschland. Um, so possibly, yeah. I mean, I suppose my my the question mark I would put that is to the extent you can sort of detach globalization from capitalism, I suppose. I mean, ultimately, it sort of comes back to what we were talking about at the minute. Globalization is a sort of consequence of the particular um, international economic system that was constructed after the Second World War. So essentially, globalization happens because of you have this very open trading system which the United States promoted. Um, can you sort of detach globalization from that? Yeah. Sorry, Martin. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, I mean, again, as I say, I find it kind of hard to conceive of these sort of very intense globalized interactions without having some sort of economic underpinning. That said, I mean, there's no obvious reason why, the United States or Britain or wherever couldn't adopt a different economic model. Um, the sort of more social democratic sort of model which people like Bernie Sanders is advocating. Um, whether that's a sort of yeah, sorry, yeah, yeah, hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, sorry, yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody is sort of, yeah, as Artsam says, nobody's talking about reconstituting, a command economy in the style of the Soviet Union or anything like that. I mean, somebody like Putin, yeah, he's definitely promoting an alternative model to the West. But it's not. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Oh, okay. So yeah. Um, yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I think. I mean, I think what we're saying essentially, though. Yeah. Okay. All right. Um, yeah. Okay. I'll still. Yeah. You make the final point, and then I'll wrap up. Yeah. Austin, do you want to? Yeah. Yeah. Can you? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes, I must admit, I think that's isn't that isn't that a choice between two products from two different multinational corporations? I don't know. Anyway, but okay. I mean, yeah. I sort of understand what you're saying. Yeah. Either way, though, I mean, as I say, there's a debate. I mean, again, just to sort of conclude, I suppose, the debate in the literature, as I say, a lot of the publications on the reading list come from the 1990s, where, as I say, you seem to have this sort of wave of democracy and this period of this sort of intense globalization, and a lot of people making this connection. Yeah, as I say, from the perspective of 2020. Yeah, I mean, the results seem rather less clear cut, where we are seeing a sort of authoritarian counter reaction. The sort of teleological view that globalization, capitalism, and all the rest of it was going to lead to the spread of democracy, stronger democratic institutions. I think that's definitely sort of been called into question now, um, which is interesting. I mean, whether that's a sort of repudiation of capitalism in general or a particular model of capitalism, I think that's debatable. I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, I don't think even somebody like Bernie Sanders. I mean, I don't think he's sort of saying we've got to reject the capitalist model in its entirety, but he's basically saying you need a better healthcare system and give workers better wages, better working conditions, which maybe by American standards is pretty radical, but elsewhere I think maybe not quite so much. But anyway, that's interesting. All right, yeah. Final point. Yeah, I think I'd say the final slide deals with the sort of Clinton administration, but we're going to have a class on Clinton anyway, so I'm not going to dwell on him too much now. But I mean, the broad point is though that I think Clinton sort of very much buys into this idea of globalization being a sort of positive overall a positive force. I mean, he did acknowledge that there was a sort of negative or dark side to globalization. So yeah, Clinton, as I say, sort of kind of buys into the idea of democratic peace, that globalization was also a force for spreading democracy. But yeah, again, critics of Clinton would basically argue, well, what sort of democratic model was the United States keen to promote? Okay, anyway, we'll talk about Clinton, as I say, in more detail on another occasion. So yeah, in terms of essay, I'll send an email now confirming this, but yeah, we'll say the end of the month or beginning of May for the deadline. So you've got a couple more weeks to think about that. Otherwise, I think we will bring it to a conclusion there. Unless anybody's got any other questions or anything to say. If not, then I will speak to you. I won't speak to you next week because it's Easter Monday. So I'll speak to you in a couple of weeks' time. So yeah. Okay, right. Thank you very much. You are free to go. So enjoy your Easter break, such as it is, in isolation. But we'll we'll manage. It's going to be a strange Easter, but there we are. Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.